A brief introduction, I guess all I could say about myself is that I'm a teacher and a teacher of history. And it's overstating it to say that I have been concerned with maritime security in the IOR. It would be more accurate to say that I have consistently been concerned with forms of engagement, negotiation, and cross-cultural connections in the IOR. So let me move straight, therefore, into the area that I was asked to speak on, which is maritime security. One of the first things to be remembered when we talk of maritime security is that there is historically, prior to the 18th century in the Indian Ocean world, there is no such thing as maritime security. Maritime security is a concern of nation states. So we have maritime engagements, we have maritime battles, a few of them, but security as we understand it today does not exist. Because security as we understand it today assumes the existence of nations and nation states. And those are very much a development in Europe from about the 14th century and in Asia only in the late 18th, maybe 19th century. We had kingdoms, we had empires, we had trans-sea empires as well. But the kinds of ideas that we put together as security do not exist. Security historically has always been handled locally by the local coastal communities, who are particularly a threat from any kind of predation from the sea. I will not even use the word piracy, because piracy too is linked to the notion of legality and sovereignty, and these in the Indian Ocean world came in with the Europeans. So one cannot really talk about maritime security. On the other hand, we can talk about multiple forms of engagement in the maritime world. And here we have, in the Indian context, a long history of forms of engagement. So one of the earliest is probably in the 7th century CE, when the Chalukya emperor Pulakeshin decided to launch an attack on the island of what is referred to in that inscription of the 8th century as the island of Puri. This is actually the island of Elephanta. And this is regarded as being the first maritime expedition, but it is not to do with security of the coast. It is to do with control of the trade that comes across the Arabian Sea from the Arab world, from the Persian Gulf world, so the Red Sea world, the Persian Gulf world, the Arabian Sea into India. So it is an attempt at getting into the profits of that trade rather than actually and what we today would call security. How this was received by the inhabitants of Puri, we don't know. Not surprisingly, the inscription doesn't tell us anything about the reactions from the island. What we do know is that there is this very lyrical section in the inscription which says that the sails of the ships that he had organized were so large that they looked like the billowing monsoon clouds, except that the sails were white rather than the gray of the clouds. Allowing for poetic license, it still is apparently a pretty large armada that goes. How it went, where it was built, who manned it, what were the concerns, we don't know. And as early as the 7th century, there is no doubt that these engagements were not using the ship itself as a weapon of war, not even having the ship loaded with different kinds of weapons. More likely, the ship was transport. So, armed warriors who then were taken to the island, landed on the island, and then there was a land-based battle. The second major example that we have belongs to the 11th century, when we have the much touted example of Rajaraja Chola's major engagement across the Bay of Bengal to the island of what is referred to in the inscription as Kadaram, but basically to Srivijaya. It took a very long time to narrow it down to Nagapattinam as the point from which the Armada left. Again, inscriptions tell us lots about the glory of the king and the might of the navy, but it doesn't give us numbers. But what we do know is that having landed at Srivijaya, there is a land-based engagement again. The ships were probably marginally protected, but there isn't a clear idea of defending the land or attacking another land through the sea and with the sea itself as the arena of conflict. It is land always as the arena of conflict, and it is primarily the land itself that is fought over. We then have perhaps our first indication of security, which comes in the 13th century. This is the so-called Battle of Exar, which is off the coast of Borivali, and that was launched by probably the Shilahara kings of the Konkan coast, maybe the Kadambas as well, but most likely the Shilaharas of the coast, who, and here is perhaps your first idea of security that comes in. Because they said, the inscription again says that the creek near Exar was known to be the haunt of pirates, and therefore the king equipped his ships in order to sail into the creek and to attack the pirate headquarters. Where the pirate headquarters is, how many ships, again, we do not know. These are among our earliest areas of some kind of maritime-based engagement. But as I said, security is not, except in the last, when there is the issue of piracy, there is an element of the idea of security. This is, broadly speaking, from the state. On the other hand, we have, particularly again on the Konkan coast, we have a whole lot of hero stones. A hero stone, a vehicle, is specifically a commemorative stone which marks a point at which a hero died, defending his land against some outsiders. Many of the hero stones along the Konkan coast give us pictures of boats. For those of you who are posted or who are near Goa or who have access to Goa, there is the museum in what used to be the Sikh Cathedral, and they have a large number of hero stones that they have collected and have put on display. Almost all of them have boats. We can see different kinds of boats. So we have the clear indication of predation from sea defended on land by some hero. No names, of course, but an idea of predation. Now, is this security as we understand it today? In one sense, yes. In another sense, no. Security as we understand it today is to do with borders, is to do with the preservation of the borders, is to do with clearly understood aspects of predation and aspects of defense against predation. And that predation is primarily seen as being by another nation state against one nation state. So, as I said right at the beginning, there is inherent in the notion of maritime security today the idea of defense in national terms, not in terms of localized conflicts. This entire idea of defense, as I had started saying, actually dates back to probably around the 16th century in Europe. And in many ways, the basis of the idea of defense is the 17th century text by Hugo Grotius, which talks about the mare clausum and the mare liberum, the open sea and the closed sea. So it argues that the idea of the open seas can exist in Europe where nations exist, where nations know their boundaries, and where nations understand the importance of international law and all obey international law. This is the mare liberum, This is the freedom of the seas, but this is also the closed sea, because this is the closed sea where law defines the boundaries. And therefore, you have the second aspect of maritime security, which is that security is necessarily defined in legal terms. Legal terms would define areas of access, methods of access, and modes of access. And the understanding that a transgression, and the word I'm deliberately using, a transgression of any or all of these is seen as a hostile action to be perceived as a threat to internal and coastal security, and therefore to be regarded in exactly that fashion. This, again, is a late development even in Europe. And therefore, if you look earlier, if you look at perhaps the greatest of the sailors of Europe, the Vikings never talked about security. They talked of raiding. So we have talk of the Danish raiders, the Viking raiders, but the word that is always used is raiding. Raiding is not the same as security. These develop, well, two actually points at which one can really talk about security from the perspective from the modern perspective. One is the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1493, where the Pope officially divided the world into two halves, north to south, with the western areas being only Spanish and the eastern areas being only Portuguese expansion. Now, this is your first official statement and official treaty which lays a claim to the oceanic spaces, and it is a treaty which draws a line in the oceanic spaces to divide the landed worlds into two parts. So it is your first attempt at partitioning the ocean. That can be seen as the beginning of maritime security. To this would come the next, which is 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia was technically just a land-based system, because this was a treaty which effectively said that no country will interfere in the succession dispute of any other country. But it talked of the nation. So the Peace of Westphalia defined national boundaries, and to this was added Hugo Grotius and the conflict over access to new markets. The oceans, remember, are still not regarded as defined or closed spaces outside of Europe. So Mare Liberum in the outside world was also Mare Clausum in the context of the countries that were fighting it out in Europe. So the Portuguese, for example, claimed that the Indian Ocean world was their world, and it was therefore the closed world of the Indian Ocean in which no other Europeans were permitted to enter. The Dutch in particular, and that's where Hugo Grotius' argument comes in, argued that this was also Mare Liberum because of the absence of any kind of international law and international system that operated in those seas. The inherent idea in the notion of maritime security is the idea of sovereignty of the sea. And this begins to be asserted by the Portuguese in the 16th century. The Portuguese claimed that the seas were theirs because of the need for controlling the seas, but more to establish a monopoly on pepper. There is the monopoly that is established not by conquest of the land, but by rerouting the trade and the ships that move across the Indian Ocean world. And here comes the next element, which said that if you buy the pass from us, then we will provide you security against the possible pirates on the sea. So security here goes back to the old idea of security in terms of predation, not in terms of national security. 1534 comes the great attack on the Portuguese fortress of Deu, where there is a combined armada that is sent out by the Ottoman Emperor, by the Calicut Zamorin, and on the land side by the Sultan of Gujarat. It was a failure, mainly 1534, 1536. Mainly because the Calicut Navy never got out of the harbor. It was stopped by the Portuguese before it got out. So you get the next element of maritime predation, which is of blockades. And the Ottoman is a different context altogether, because the Ottoman Empire has learned about the aspects of maritime security and maritime warfare through their multiple attacks on the Mediterranean area. For example, the Ottoman attack on the city of Venice, which was a clear combination of Ottoman methods, Portuguese methods, and Venetian methods. And it is looked at as the first blockade by sea, because it is by sea, by warships, and by encircling the harbor so that nothing comes into the harbor and nothing goes out of the harbor. This is resolved finally by a treaty, but Venice suffers a major blow to its trade. This brings me to my last element of maritime security prior to the 18th century. Security here is seen still not in terms of the nation and nationalism and national boundaries. It is seen in terms of the protection of the arenas of trade by non-state participants, with the possible exception of the Portuguese, sorry. The Portuguese establish a state-based system, and that state-based system is responsible for organizing the caravans of the ships. They were called kafilas, organizing the nature of the security that is to be provided to the ships, organizing also the passes, and making sure that the ships get passes only from point to point, so that the ship checks in at every port in order to get the pass to the next area of trade. All of this is part of that maritime world. It is to do with the monopoly of pepper. It is to do with acquiring revenues from trade, but it is not yet about attacking the traders as representative of a nation. This perhaps is best summed up by something that I have talked about very frequently, a letter of 1620, which is written by the Adil Shah Sultan of Bijapur, who writes a letter to the Ottoman Emperor saying that 1 century ago you sent your troops to fight against the Franks. Now there are 2 other groups of Franks that have come in, all of whom claim to be lords of the sea. How can you be a lord of something that does not stand still? The sea is common to all. It is the land which is divided. Implicit in this is the idea of security as terrestrial boundaries, not as aquatic concern. So, what can be perhaps called a terra nexus, a nexus which focuses on the land rather than on the sea. So, it is to the sea from the land, to the land from the sea, but it is the land which is to be secured, not the sea itself. These elements become increasingly part of the maritime world of the Indian Ocean region. So we have, for instance, the claim by the Kannur rulers, particularly with the Kunyali Marakas, the Navy of Kannur, the Ali Rajas of Navy, who claim to be regents of the sea. Note that they very often don't call themselves the lords of the sea, they call them the regents of the sea. So the regent is somebody who is in charge. So they are the ones who are in charge of the sea. They are the admirals, they are the viceroy. If you move to the 17th century again, we have a lot on the Konkan coast of the attacks of the Siddhis. The Siddhis, based in the island fortress of Janjira, attacked all along the coast, particularly the Maratha dominions. And in response to these Maratha attacks comes the first state engagement with security, the security of the land, with Shivaji establishing a fairly decent chain of coastal fortresses. We have the island fortress of Sindhudurg, we have Vijayadurg, also called Kheria, we have the number of monuments that come up, the smaller settlements. They attempt to target uh, the Siddhis, and when Aurangzeb comes on, he converts the Siddhis into the admirals of the Mughal navy. So the Mughal navy now emerges as a construct. Let me now move to a different dimension of. By the 18th century, Indians had begun to participate actively in the idea of maritime security. This was still, however, not deep blue, not the blue water security, it was coastal security. Perhaps the best example of this would be Kanhoji Angre, who establishes a strong navy consisting of primarily light and fast uh, warships, which were very often oared rather than masted and sailed, because it was often faster to use the oars in the coastal water than it was to use the sails. There is this work by Clement Dowling, who was one of those who was involved in, first of all, the first engagement of the combined British and Dutch Portuguese forces against Kanhoji Angre. Then in the failed that failed, then in the failed attack on the fortress of Gheria, which is Vijayadurg. All of this talked about how there was a knowledge of the coastal waters. There was the ability to be able to use the oars and the bows and arrows equally well, and to be able to have the marksmanship that the Europeans did not have, so that even in strong surf, the marksmen usually found their mark. So it is a combined sailing and fighting force that is on board the ship, oars as well as bows and arrows. So they could exchange at very short notice one for the other. There is extensive patrolling of the coast, but again, the idea is not of defense. The idea is of claim to revenue, where Kanhoji Angre says that the Europeans can claim to be masters, sovereigns of the sea, whatever they like. But there is no possibility of staying at sea all the time. It is necessary always to touch that land, and the land is his. Therefore, to get access to the land, they need to take a pass from him. In the same fashion that the Europeans demanded that Indian traders buy a pass in order to travel on the sea, Kanhoji Angre demanded that the Europeans purchase a pass from him in order to get access to the land, which in many ways I would think was a much more effective method, because whatever else you do, you have to touch base at land somewhere else. So we're back to the supremacy of land over sea. Maritime security as an extension of land security. Secure the land by patrolling the seas, no question of securing the seas to prevent access to the land. This is the essential dimension of maritime security prior to the 18th century. 18th century, and here I'm probably talking to those who are already well versed in this history. The Navy as we know it today has its roots in the Bombay Marine, established by the British, on British lines, on more accurately, European lines, and then used and developed to become the Royal Indian Navy, and then the Royal Navy, and then the Indian Navy. The progression, therefore, is through colonial rule and the multiple engagements prior to colonial rule, which then defined and put into place European notions of security, aspects of nationalism as defined in more rigid European terms, and in the creation of a nation state, the boundaries of the nation state, and the idea of the boundaries of the nation state extending into the waters as well. 8 kilometers, 12 kilometers, 8 miles, 12 miles. All of you would be far more familiar with those details than I am. But this is your range of maritime security. I will, I think, stop over here and ask for questions.